Hi, this is Alan Berube. I'm a senior fellow and the director of research at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and I'm one of the authors of a new report entitled The State of Metropolitan America. And this presentation provides a brief look at this new report, which examines the demographic trends that affected the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas in the 2000s. And our report finds the nation in demographic transformation along 5 different dimensions of change. We're growing fast, we're diversifying rapidly, we're facing an aging tsunami, we're selectively educating our population, and we're dividing by income. And our major findings are threefold. First, America's 100 largest metropolitan areas are on the front lines of the nation's demographic transformation. Metros are the vanguard of our nation's growth. The U.S. population stood at 307 million in mid-2009, up from about 282 million at the beginning of the decade. And that's growth of 8.8%, which is on target to add 28 million people by the end of the decade. Compared to national growth, our major metropolitan areas grew by 10.5%, or 19 million people, between 2000 and 2009. And this continues the trend lines that we've seen in the past 60 years. Decade after decade, our top 100 metros have added people at a rate faster than the nation, so that they now contain a full 2/3 of our national population. This was especially the case in the 2000s, when fully 77% of U.S. population growth occurred in these 100 largest metro areas. And growth brings opportunities, of course. It means greater demand for goods and services, greater demand for housing, the ability to replenish our workforce. But growth also brings challenges, particularly in an era of constrained resources and global environmental concerns. In the 100 largest metro areas, our cities and high-density suburbs grew a little under 5% in the 2000s, while less developed counties grew at more than 3 times that rate, so that by 2008, more than 40% of metropolitan population lived in spread-out areas, creating sort of a distended autoscape where most residents are completely dependent on their cars for transportation. So the sprawling growth of this past decade raises really stark challenges. How does the U.S. grow in both fiscally and environmentally sustainable ways? Diversity is the second element of demographic change, and here again metros are at the leading edge. Racial and ethnic minorities accounted for an astonishing 83% of national population growth this past decade. As a result of that, Hispanics now make up about 15% of the nation's population, and blacks comprise a little over 12%. Racial and ethnic minorities make up an even larger share of population in the top 100 metro areas. We're well on the path to becoming a majority-minority nation, and our big metro areas are leading the way. Today, in fact, 17 metro areas are already majority-minority, compared to 14 in 2000 and 5 in 1990. And a total of 31 metropolitan areas already have majority-minority child populations. Part of the growth in minority populations comes from immigration. New immigrants accounted for roughly 30% of national population growth in the 2000s, and 33% in large metro areas. Thus, while 1 in every 8 Americans today is foreign-born, the same is true for 1 in every 6 residents of our major metropolitan areas. Unlike earlier periods in our history, immigration is one of the most contentious issues in our nation, best illustrated by the state of Arizona's recent actions. Yet the benefits of immigration, and really diversity more broadly, are immense. It means new markets, new ideas, and new workers to replace those that retire. So here the central challenge is how we embrace diversity and adapt to becoming a majority-minority nation. The third demographic hallmark of the decade is aging. The United States is experiencing an aging tsunami, and metros are aging faster than the nation. In fact, the Beatles imagined this a long time ago. The first of the baby boomers actually turned 64 at the beginning of 2010. And the combined population of these boomers and people who are already over the age of 65 has already surpassed 117 million. As a sign of things to come, the nation saw 40% growth in this near senior population, those between the ages of 55 and 64, and large metros are at the forefront of that aging wave too. As with growth, the aging phenomenon will largely be a suburban one. In the 100 largest metro areas, growth of boomers and seniors was faster in suburbs than in cities. Today, in fact, 71% of boomers and seniors in the largest metros reside in suburbia. So at the metro scale, aging is posing a vexing dilemma. How do we remake suburbs to fit the needs of an aging population? And major metros are also challenged by simultaneously concentrating both aging and diversifying populations. Across the top 100 metros, child populations are now over 50% minority compared to only 25% of senior populations. A sort of cultural generation gap is emerging in metropolitan America, raising questions as to whether older Americans will do what it takes to educate the most diverse generation of children in the history of the nation. The fourth pillar of our demographic restructuring is education, really the fuel for our economic prosperity. And in this respect, the U.S. got smarter this decade, with the share of adults holding four-year college degrees rising from 24% in 2000 to 28% in 2008. Here again, metros lead the nation, seeing the share of residents with four-year degrees rise to 31% in 2008. Yet this masks pronounced racial and ethnic disparities within metropolitan areas. In 2008, only 14% of Hispanics and 20% of blacks had a bachelor's degree. That contrasted sharply with attainment levels for whites and Asians. These disparities pose a central challenge. How do we prepare our future workforce to compete globally for the jobs of this century? And the final element of America's changing demographics naturally follows education, and that's income. During the 2000s, at the national scale, low-wage workers lost ground, seeing their hourly earnings decline by 4%. Middle-wage workers were not insulated from this trend either, but only high-wage workers actually saw their hourly earnings rise. Metros stood at the vanguard of this unfortunate trend, too. Low-wage workers in major metros suffered greater declines in their wages than the national average, while by contrast, high-wage workers made greater gains. And to complicate matters, the geography of poverty is also shifting. Suburbs saw much greater increases in poverty during the past decade than did cities. As a result, the majority of poor people now live in suburbs for the first time. The challenges to these trends are real and immediate. How do low and moderate income Americans make ends meet? And how does the suburbanization of poverty impact our ability to alleviate it? This aggregate overview leads to our second major finding, which is that the shape and scale of demographic transformation varies profoundly across metropolitan America. This demographic transformation doesn't conform to the way the Census Bureau organizes the country along 9 contiguous traditional regional groupings, familiar groupings like New England and the Mountain West and the Pacific Coast. Instead, a new metro map of the United States is emerging. Our report identifies 7 types of metropolitan areas, grouping these leading communities by their demographic similarities on dimensions of growth, diversity, and educational attainment, rather than their physical proximity. So let me just highlight 3 of these metro types now. At one end of the spectrum lie 9 next frontier metros, the demographic success stories of the 2000s. These places are fast-growing, rapidly diversifying, and outperforming the nation in educational attainment. 8 of the 9 lie west of the Mississippi River, with Washington, D.C. as the only eastern exception. The 19 metropolitan areas in the new Heartland cluster span the nation geographically. These places are fast-growing and highly educated, but have lower shares of Hispanic and Asian populations than the national average. They include southern communities where blacks are the dominant minority group, such as Atlanta and Charlotte, as well as largely white Midwestern and Western metro areas, such as Indianapolis and Portland, Oregon. Another 19 metros are skilled anchors, slow-growing, less diverse metro areas that nonetheless boast higher than average levels of educational attainment. And 17 of these 19 lie in the Northeast and the Midwest, including large regions like Boston and Philadelphia, as well as smaller regions such as Akron and Albany. And this new metro map of the United States forces us to think outside the conventional regional boxes that have informed America's narrative for generations. The South, for instance, counts at least one member in each of the 7 metropolitan categories. Very different demographic destinies confront a Greensboro versus a Charlotte or an Austin versus a San Antonio. Likewise, the notion of a unified Rust Belt stretching across large portions of the Northeast and the Midwest overlooks the factors that distinguish populations in Rochester from those in Cleveland and those in Indianapolis from those in Chicago. This leads to my final point. Demographic transformation requires action at both the macro and metro scales. The trends presented here affect, if not drive, some of the most difficult challenges facing the nation. Climate change is shaped by the demographics of growth. The backlash against immigration is driven by the demographics of diversity in immigration. The public sector fiscal crisis is determined by the demographics of aging. Our ability to compete globally is dictated by the demographics of education. And building a resilient middle class is prescribed by the demographics of income. U.S. prosperity, in short, depends on whether we can master demographic change and leverage its possibilities. Change of this magnitude really requires a remaking of the partnership between the macro and the metro. Federal and state governments, of course, should lead where they must, given the need for uniform and scaled solutions to challenges that are ultimately beyond the scope of any one community. At the same time, metropolitan areas must innovate where they should, given their distinct demographic starting points and their special devolved responsibilities in our federalist system. The State of Metropolitan America report recommends a series of macro and metro responses across all 5 dimensions of demographic change, identifying areas like immigration and natural resource policy, where large and common challenges merit federal and state action, and highlighting different public priorities that emerge for metropolitan areas based on their individual demographic realities. So let's end where we began. Like earlier times in our history, America is undergoing a massive demographic transformation. Our metropolitan areas are on the front lines of that transformation, as these trends affect them first, and at a speed and scale and complexity that's truly historic. Grappling with demographic transformation is not going to be easy, but if we can manage it, the 21st century promises to be a positive and prosperous one for the United States.